Thanks.
And we're live.
Good morning, or I suppose good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. I hope that everyone is well, healthy, safe, and enjoying a lot of music making and cello playing. I thought for today's cello chat, I'm very excited to be back with you all. It's been a little while, and of course the world has changed a lot since we last were together. But for today, the theme is contemporary music. Where should I begin? And the reason why I thought that might be a nice discussion for us today is that I get a lot of questions about that, and it's often very difficult for me to answer because when you play a lot of contemporary music, every piece is very, very different. And I don't mean just slightly different or stylistically different, like you almost can't even compare apples to oranges. And so I thought that it would be nice to have a little bit of a discussion about the scope of pieces that I do often come across, and hopefully from that you'll be able to gain tools for your own repertoire as it comes in, fresh off the press. So the first piece that I would like to share with everyone is a work that John Zorn wrote for me, I guess we're coming up on 7 years ago. It's called Babel, The Confusion of Tongues. And this piece is essentially a solo cello piece. However, there is one extra technique in it. He calls for a wooden dowel to be put between the strings of the cello so it sounds almost unpitched for most of the instrument. The C string is open, but everything else sounds a little distorted and strange. I don't actually have my wooden dowel on me, and to be completely frank, I actually use a chopstick. I find it gets the best sound. Now, for this particular piece, I think the first step, whenever you, well, first of all, before you play any piece, it's important to get a sense of what the scope of the piece is. Is there electronics involved? Do you need any extra equipment? In this case, it would be the chopstick or wooden dowel. And then also spending a little time figuring out how to actually read the notes, the notation itself. Most pieces are generally straightforward, but sometimes composers will experiment with different types of notation. And so for this, let's see, I'm gonna just hold this up to the camera. Hopefully you can kind of see. Sorry it's so, let's see, maybe if I move closer. You can see that there are two lines for the music. The upper line is when I strike the chopstick or wooden dowel, and the lower line is the open C string. And if I hold it up closely, I don't know if you can see, but there are various markings like SP or P or N below the staff. And what that means is that Zorn is asking for different types of ponticello, sometimes more extreme than others. And it whizzes by pretty quickly too. So just to kind of give an example, what I'll do is I'll do my best. Actually, maybe if I do it this way. No, this way's better. I'll just hit play so you can have a chance to listen to it and see if you can kind of follow along. There you go. That's a pretty fun piece to play. So obviously, like any other repertoire, whether it's Bach, Haydn, or whatnot, when the first several weeks that I was learning this piece, I was playing it extremely slowly and trying to drill in the when is it a 3, when is it a 2? Do I want to actually play it all separate bows, or do I want to have any up-ups or down-downs? In the end, I decided to do it all as it comes, and just to do my best to keep track of when it's a 3 and when it's a 2 or a 4. I also struggled with maybe altering the notation a little bit so that it conformed more with what I was kind of used to expecting in notation. But what I found in the end is that I chose to instead follow John's notation and to kind of train myself to almost read its own language, which I think is probably something that you will find yourselves as you play in different pieces, that in a way each piece is its own world or its own language. So the next piece that I would like to share kind of takes the sonic world in a different direction. It's a piece entitled From the Bones to the Fossils by Paola Prestini. And this was part of a project that is entitled Sound of Science, where each composer that I commissioned was tasked with writing a piece inspired by the scientists of their choice. And so in this, each composer did have to use some type of electronic element, but it was sort of open, how they wish to do it themselves. And the issue with this one is that as you learn a new piece, sometimes the technology is prescribed, meaning that the composer specifically asks for, let's say, a loop pedal, or a distortion pedal, or maybe a backing track, which is sort of like a recording that plays while you're playing live. And sometimes the composers don't ask for that, but you find in learning the piece that you want to add a certain electronic element in order to help realize the composition as conceived by the composer. It may not have been written in that way, but you realize that it actually helps the piece. And so not all technological solutions are actually written in by the composer themselves. This particular piece, the composer did actually request a loop pedal. And let's see, I will just play. The notation for this one is actually quite straightforward, but it might be helpful to see how the loop pedal is integrated. So I'm going to skip a little bit into the piece. Let's see. All right, so it's just coming up. And again, here, this is the right page. And you can see that all the noodly stuff you're hearing is right over here. And then let's see if I can, there we go. So you can see right over here these double stops. That is how she notated the loop. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to hit play now, and then I'll hold up the music. So that should give you an idea of how a particular composer decided to actually write in and notate how one should build loops. And all of those loops are built fresh, live. Not every piece that has loops does it that way. Sometimes we will build them into things called backing tracks. But for this particular piece, I do build them live. Before I move on to the next kind of, I want to keep on expanding out like how technology plays a role in approaching new pieces. I see there's a question from Aristide Pierre in regard to my time with Starker, which I'm happy to answer. I loved my work with Mr. Starker. He was a great teacher, a great man, a great cellist. He was very tough on his students, but he was also very kind. I always found him to be very fair, actually. And he cared a lot about his students, about cello, about the world. Brilliant, brilliant man. And, one thing that maybe some people might find funny is that, obviously I've made my career playing a lot of contemporary music. And that isn't exactly something that Mr. Starker did himself. But he was always very encouraging. And he was very happy when I, landed my job with the Kronos Quartet, and very supportive. He just wanted to make sure that I continued to spread the gospel, as it were, of music and of cello and humanity. And so, I had a great time with Mr. Starker. Next question is, how do you provide a better foundation to your quartet sound as the cellist? I have always struggled with balance, when to play more or less. I mean, that is a good question. It's also very, it's hard to answer without getting into specifics. But in any given moment, well, first of all, the general job of the cellist in a quartet, when you go across the sound range, we have to support pretty much everyone. We're at the bottom, and it's not about, I think sometimes cellists may misunderstand that and think, well, we have to play loud all of the time. And that isn't true at all. We have to support everything. We have to balance out the group. We are the foundation for sound, balance, intonation, all of it. So color, nuance. There's a lot of responsibility that comes from the bottom. And we also have to play soft, So how we find the right level of balance, I think it really depends on the music. It depends on the passage. It depends on who has the melody, how many people have the melody, the voicing, harmony, tempo, style. So I think that even if you are, let's say, not playing forte, we always have to think of our role in contribution with the overall sound of the group. So it's hard to answer that question without getting into specifics. But I would just say that in every situation, whether you're playing Mozart, Beethoven, Shostakovich, Ligeti, whatever it is, that somehow, whether you're playing forte or piano, that your sound is very active in the character and in contributing to what is going on dynamically. And I don't mean just volume, but like the energy of the ensemble. So we'd have to get into specifics to be able to answer more detailed than that. Next question is, in what ways do in what way does playing professionally in a string quartet affect the way you play and practice individually? Actually, that's a very good question, because when you play in a string quartet, we do have a different approach to even intonation or melody. I do find that playing in quartets has changed my attitude as far as like how I play a concerto even, and how voices interact with other parts. You do tend to think more contrapuntally when you play a lot of string quartets. I think that the rub probably occurs the most when we deal with intonation, because obviously when we play in a quartet, we have to be very mindful of where we put the thirds and major thirds, minor thirds, sevenths, perfect intervals, etc., etc. I think that when we play more soloistically, it's actually a good idea to kind of approach intonation a little bit differently, because if we tune too harmonically minded, I think that we kind of miss out on a lot of expression. So I do encourage my students to think more, as far as intonation is concerned, to think more melodically minded when they're playing solo music. But yeah, absolutely, the rules of major thirds and tenths and things like that, it can be very frustrating for quartet players, but it's good to have that quality of sound in our ears when we play all music, whether it's solo Bach or playing in an orchestra. Next question is, do you have any exercises to get control of your vibrato? I've understood the foundations, but my arm has a tendency to vibrate faster than I intend. And I guess the follow-up question is, how does one practice in order to attain a wider vibrato? Any tips? Well, I think that, yes, absolutely. We need to be able to vibrate fast, and we need to be able to vibrate slowly. It's much better for us musically to be able to have a broad palette of color and expression. So even though all of us have our sort of like the vibrato, our go-to vibrato, let's say, as we shape phrases, the vibrato, I hope, would change, because that helps us to, increase the tension in a certain place in the phrase, or release the tension in another part. So we need to be able to have that kind of control. There are a couple of exercises that I like to do. One is with the metronome. I put the metronome on at 51, and I basically do different tempos. So like if it's like eighth notes, and one type of eighth note is a very even eighth note, just to kind of loosen everything up for range. I call it range of motion. And then the other one is more of almost an attack, where you feel the forearm is engaging the attack of the vibrato, which I think is a very important lesson, because the vibrato doesn't come from the finger or the wrist. Cello vibrato almost always comes from the forearm. So we need to feel that the forearm, I call it the engine, like in a car. The engine has to keep on moving. Even if we're going from finger to finger, we have to keep the engine on, right? So that's one exercise. Another exercise I think is very helpful, not so much to increase vibrato. I know you're asking about decreasing the speed, but it also might help to kind of rethink how vibrato works, especially when we think of it as going from note to note, and especially when we think of it in faster notes, not just whole notes or half notes or even quarter notes. And that's where, if we actually, instead of thinking of it as vibrato, thinking of it as how we balance the hand, shifting the weight. I should really grab my cello, but shifting the weight from, say, one finger to the next finger to the next finger, there is a little bit of a rebalancing in the hand. And if we're actually really balanced, each finger that we put down is like a release, right? We are there's like this, I don't know, kinetic energy. And then as soon as we put our finger down, we release into that note. And if our hands are really relaxed, not tight, there's a little bit of a wiggle that occurs, right? And I equate it to like if there's, let's say, a jello, blob of jello, and you go, then the jello kind of jiggles. And we should have a little bit of jiggle at the beginning of each note. And that, in a sense, I call that the beginning of vibrato, right? And really, if you're playing a passage, da, 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 if you're playing a bunch of eighth notes, all you really have are a bunch of beginnings of vibrato, really. So you don't have to worry about how do I vibrate from one note to the next. It's more about just keeping everything alive, keeping your hand loose and keeping the engine running. So that might help kind of free things up physically as far as your approach to vibrato. But yes, you find that vibrato, having a wide palette of expression for vibrato does go hand in hand with having a balanced left hand. So you really want to pursue both, but not separately, but together. Next question is, in what way, oh wait, I think I already did this one. Oh, but can you give advice to young quartets in terms of, how do I practice individually? Oh, that's, I guess I kind of did answer that though. And even like if you play Dvorak concerto, when you approach solo music from the sense of a chamber musician, especially if you play sonatas, you definitely have a different idea of like my voice versus, say, the piano voice, that you think of it more about how thematic ideas are passed from voice to voice, maybe from the left hand to the the right hand to the left hand to the cello and so you do listen to the composition, I think, more holistically than if you don't have experience playing a lot of chamber music. And so I think it does affect the way that we see our roles at any given moment in the music, whether we're playing, Beethoven Sonata, Dvorak Concerto, or even solo Bach. Any advice I can give to young quartets in terms of rehearsal efficiency and making decisions on musical ideas? Absolutely. I think that we all have very strong ideas about how music should go, tempos. Should we take time here? Should we not take time? Et cetera, et cetera. And that should be encouraged, However, when you work in a group, what you feel strongly about in a given moment there's a constructive way to move your ideas forward. Number one, everybody's ideas should be taken with respect, right? Even if you completely 100% disagree with somebody, you have to be respectful of everyone's ideas, and you have to give everyone equal shot. You might find in trying different ideas, which, by the way, if it's someone else's idea, you have to give it 100% effort. You may find that you like their idea, unexpectedly so, like, gosh, that worked out much better than I thought. And then the group tries your idea, and you might say, gosh, I thought that would work out, but that sounds terrible, So you have to be open and flexible to that possibility. So respectful and open. The other part of it is that even if, you might have an opinion like, yeah, I think we should probably take this tempo. I feel very strongly about it. We've tried it a different way. I can see that can work, but, I still like my idea better. Well, hopefully, whether it's a concert or a public masterclass or even a studio class, or even playing it for your chamber music coach, in some type of a pressurized situation, in the context of playing the entire piece, that's really the only way to know if that particular idea will fly, right? And a lot of ideas don't work. And you go out on stage and you realize, oh, that really didn't work. I mean, don't apologize for it, because this is sort of like it's a process, right? So it's like, you know what? You turn to the viola player, you know what? Your idea actually, next concert, maybe it's tomorrow night, let's try your idea. Because, now that I think about it, maybe we should try it a different way or something. And what you'll find, first of all, over time, your group will come closer to whatever approach the group will take, whether it's, it might be one Beethoven quartet, you take that experience to the next Beethoven quartet, or even the Prokofiev quartet or some other piece. But what you find is that everything continues to evolve as well. And that's another thing you have to be open to. I don't believe, no matter what piece you're playing, Bach, quartets, Haydn concerto, I think that the notion, I'm old enough now to think that the notion that somehow you're fixed into an interpretation and you stick with that for the rest of your life is completely wrong, dumb. I mean, I'm sorry to be so blunt. It's just that, how many of you feel the same way about something that you did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? We're all evolving. We all reach different points in our lives. You might get married, you might get a divorce, you might become a parent, you might not. Like you might just feel, you might read a book and realize that your approach to Schumann is completely changed, And so that's okay. That's completely okay to rethink your approach on music. So you have to be open-minded to that. And in the process, last thing I'll say, is when you play in a group for a long time, these relationships also change too. And so one person might be more the traffic cop, and then over the course of the next 10 years, someone else might become the traffic cop. And so it's okay to allow people's characters and personalities and humanity to continue to evolve. And if you're able to do that with respect, then you'll always continue to grow. And that's really all we can. We don't know what direction we're going to grow into, but you have to keep the ball moving. You have to keep the conversation moving forward. And you have to keep on going up and up. So, okay, so we're, I think, let's see, did I get please jump in if I skipped something. But I think the next question is, okay, I found it. What are a few core principles you encourage your students to focus on in the practice room? Sound, intonation, rhythm. And I don't mean square, I mean pulse, character, phrasing, integrity. And ask a lot of questions, right? So many times we try to think of what is the solution? What is the best solution? How do I figure this passage out? But that's a good plan if you want to just get from point A to point B. The problem is that point B is the actual beginning. It isn't point A. So you have to keep on throwing, I call it throwing spaghetti against the wall, but you have to look at the same object from different angles to fully understand it and how you feel about it. So don't ever stop to ask questions. Can I recall a piece of advice from any of your teachers that has proved to be particularly impactful throughout your career? Kind of. Actually, Paul Katz told me something just last year, that I think was probably baked into the message from the very beginning, even before I studied with Paul Katz. But it's actually very good advice, and I would say the same thing to every one of you all. And that's that be yourself. You know, I think that if you are true to yourself, you will find the right way. It's a very confusing prospect, and it's a very challenging career. There are certainly easier careers out there. And sometimes we have in our mind an idea of how we think we would like to end up. Like, I definitely want to play in the, I don't know, Chicago Symphony, or I definitely want to play in a string quartet, or I definitely want to win this competition. Maybe. And maybe that is a good path for you. But there, many times what makes us feel fulfilled in life is actually not the stuff that looks good on paper as we see it when we're 22 years old. And if you are true to yourself, you will find the right path for you. I have a very good friend, cellist. I probably shouldn't say who he is. We met at Juilliard, and great cellist, a bit of a free spirit, let's just say. This guy was never going to play in the Chicago Symphony or, you know, show up to work on time ever. But, you know, he's a phenomenally talented cello player. Nicest guy on the planet. Like, good heart. Like, great heart, actually. And he struggled for many years because, I mean, he's very, because of his free spirit. And then one day, everything just kind of clicked for him. He somehow got connected with the right people. He's doing a lot of improv, a lot with electronics. He has a band. He's extremely successful now, pre-pandemic. And it's like he found his place, like who he is supposed to be as a cellist. And I'm really proud of him, really. It wasn't easy. Like 10 years ago, I would say, like, gosh, like, hope he's going to be okay. But now it's like, I know he's going to be okay because he is who he should have always been. This guy should never have been playing the 6 box suites in Wigmore Hall. Although I would definitely pay money to see that. That would be amazing. So, yeah, be true to yourself. And then things will work out the way they're supposed to. When you start working on a new obscure piece, where do you start? Thank you. That's the topic of the discussion today. How do you approach it, especially if you can't find any background information or recordings? How do you keep various technical skills in check when your schedule is very busy? Okay, well, those are 2 very different questions. But yes, thank you for bringing us back to the topic of today. For those of you, maybe many of you caught the beginning, I talked about a piece by John Zorn entitled Babel, the Confusion of Tongues, where some of the tools that I used to learn the piece from the beginning, and then also a piece by Paola Prestini called From the Bones to the Fossils, where you actually use a loop pedal. But one of the points that I was making is that it's important to have an understanding of the scope of the music that you're playing before you play it, because you are the first person to play the piece. Is it actually what we call an acoustic piece, where you don't need any bells and whistles, it's just you and the cello, in which case I would say the best approach is to actually get to know what the notes are and what the tempo is, kind of, so that you could at least sonically get a sense of what kind of sound world you're dealing with. And even in that context, even if it's an acoustic piece, if the notation is very odd, like, I don't know, I'll show you this. I just picked this up the other day because I'm thinking about learning it. It's by John Cage. It's called Etudes Borealis. And you can see that the notation, it's very openly notated. There are some quarter tones in it. And then there's these hash marks that demarcate time. And so I'm going to be spending time very painstakingly, like probably line by line, looking at, well, what are the notes, you know, and how frequently or infrequently do they occur? just to kind of get a sense of what kind of sonic world I'm going to be embodying with this piece. Although for this piece there are some recordings, so I do have that reference point available. The next couple pieces, actually, if I can, before I answer these two other questions, or actually three other questions, I just want to continue with what I wanted to share, because sometimes you will play music that has what we call pre-recorded material. In addition to electronics, it might be just extra electronic sounds, but where you have to actually record music in order to play it, right? It seems kind of backwards, but you find this a lot with like the music of Steve Reich. If you play like cello counterpoint, actually for that you can buy the backing track, which is Maya or rent, I think buy or rent, Maya Beiser's recording of the other cello parts. But if you wanted to do it yourself with all of your own cello sounds, then you actually have to go to the recording studio and record all of the parts before you can actually play it. And of course, there is a recording of that. It's been out in the world for many years now. But if you were given a piece like that, then it's sort of like, whoa, I have to record it before I even know how it sounds, and that's kind of crazy when you think about it. Very recently, about a month ago, I premiered a piece with the American Composers Orchestra by Yuan Chen Li. And in that piece, it was exactly that. I had to record the different parts in order and then on top of each other, so that I can begin to kind of imagine how this piece will work formally. And for that, all I did is I just took out my microphone, this microphone here, and GarageBand, because I'm not at home right now, so I have very limited technology, and I just recorded it. It sounded terrible, just to be honest, but it still gave me a sense of, oh gosh, that's a fifth. Oh my gosh, there's an octave right there. I should really tune that, and just kind of getting a sense in real time how everything will play out. So for this, I thought I would give an example of a piece by Graham Reynolds called The Brain, also from my Sound of Science project. And for this, I had to pre-record a lot of things in addition to overlaying that with the electronic backing track. And then I had to figure out how to play it live. So I'll just play a few minutes of that. So I'll just stop it right there. So you can see that there's a whole electronic soundscape going on. So for that, I recorded probably a dozen different cello parts throughout the piece, not just at the beginning, but throughout the piece. And then, of course, I had to play it live. And then there's the electronics. But then for the live part, I also had an array of electronics, reverbs, distortion, things like that. So it's a very heavily involved, logistically, it's very heavily involved with a lot of things. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing an organ with my feet moving around and everything. So that's sort of one extreme, if you will. And then one other piece, and then I promise I will jump back to the questions, is a piece by the West African kora master Fode Musasuso. And this is a particularly interesting approach because he is not a composer in the Western classical sense of writing down notation like this. What he does is he writes the music in his mind and he plays it on the kora. And then he records it, sends it to somebody to write it down like this, and then he sent it over to me. And I got together with Fode and we played it through, and I thought I had a pretty good grasp of what to do. Excuse me. But then when I went into the recording studio, I realized it was like, whoa, this is actually much more bare bones than I thought. Because first of all, a lot of the notation that we call the person like an arranger, but the takedown person didn't feel totally accurate to the recording that I had of Fode playing. And so what I did is I took the kind of the DNA of what Fode played, and then I improvised around it. And as I improvised in the studio, I found that it needed kind of like a B section. And so I made up my own B section with distortion and all this stuff. And then I returned back to the A section. So in a way, I didn't compose it. He composed it, but I arranged it. I certainly arranged it pretty heavily. And Fode was happy about it because, again, the DNA of the music was there. It's just I made my own version of it. And that can be very complicated because the reason why I want to bring it up is because what you begin with is certainly not what we're used to when we study in conservatory. I began with a recording and then I essentially made it up. So here is an example of the piece is called Salumba by Fode Masususo. This is what the music looks like. So on. So for any of you who were following along with the music and thinking, wait, that didn't look anything like the music, you're absolutely correct. I took the material. I think that notation was, maybe it's overly notated. And so when I say I took the DNA, is I took the essence of the harmony, the melodies, and quasi, at least the phrase form, and then I just kind of improvised from there. So, and that's how Salumba, my version of Salumba, was born. So, I'm just going to back up and hit a few questions here. Oh, and there's a question about how to maintain techniques. Oh, for sautier bowing on the cello. That's a good question because, first of all, you should always, no matter what, if you play like contemporary music or improvise or, traditional music, you always have to find ways to challenge yourself, cellistically, musically, artistically, creatively. So, but the reason why the sautier question is a good question is that what I find is that when you play a lot of contemporary music, that's actually a technique that we don't use very much. Actually, spiccato, sautier, those strokes we don't actually. I don't know why, but composers just kind of don't do it. And if you want to maintain that kind of technique, I would recommend going back and keeping up with your Sevchik and things like that. I think it's a good idea because you want to maintain yourself as a solid cellist no matter what your specialty is. That being said, it does kind of bring us to the question of technique and how technique has evolved over the years. I mean, we all know that Boccherini invented thumb position and things like that. And throughout history, what we call technique is not, the technique actually followed the music. It wasn't the other way around. So we found that we needed to let our technique evolve in order to match the music that was being written. So that continues. And right now we're experiencing an era where I guess sautier is probably being phased out. But I mean, maybe in 20 years, composers will be writing a lot of music integrating sautier. I don't know. No one can look into the crystal ball. So be open to that as well. As you play more contemporary music, you will find that you have to do practice your scales differently. I do practice different types of double stops. I do try to maintain my playing in a specific way to fit the kind of music that I play generally. So, okay. I would like to explore the cello repertoire with electroacoustics. Would you please give some suggestions on what pieces would be good to start with? And what are some transitional what are some traditional transitional pieces into modern music you would recommend? Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the pieces that I played for you today involve some type of electronic element, pre-recorded things, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that kind of repertoire is that it means you have to buy a bunch of equipment. And I think for somebody who wants to step into this world, that can be very daunting, if not expensive. So I think the best entry point into this world is actually through acoustic music. There's a lot of really great music written, of course, the Britten Suites, De Thieu, Schnittke, Gubaidulina. I think that there's a lot of music that can be explored that will broaden your scope on the instrument. I think like the first Britten Suite is fantastic, the way that, each movement is its own character world and there's a pizzicato movement. And it definitely, for me, it was a broadening experience sonically on the instrument. So, but also I think that if you have the ability to at least pick up a couple of things electronically, a nice first stepping stone could be something like Michael Gordon's Industry. It's very repetitive, but it really is it's very gnarly for thumb position, let me tell you. And in this, all you need a tube screamer. He recommends the Ibanez tube screamer, which is a distortion pedal, and a volume pedal. And so what you have it on, the distortion on, and you begin acoustically, and as the piece evolves, you just slowly open up the distortion so the piece gets more and more distorted, like an electric guitar. and it's a very rockin' piece, and it gets very loud, and it's I think it's a great piece. But yes, you will practice the heck out of your thumb position when you play it, so it's also good for that as well. There's a question about rep by black composers. Yes, those are both excellent composers. Jeffrey Mumford has written like a ton of music for solo cello, so there's a treasure trove of music by Jeffrey to explore. I'm thinking of Alvin Singleton. I would recommend looking at the Sphinx organization's website. They actually have a database, very comprehensive, of black composers throughout history. But also, I mean, I would recommend, I mean, the thing about like what I do personally, so much of what I do is by composers who are living. And so there are a couple of composers on the West Coast that I think are terrific. I think that, let's see, in New York, of course, now there's a big craze around Julius Eastman. But I would definitely look at the Sphinx Inc.'s database because they have a very comprehensive list of composers to check out. My feeling personally is that not enough black composers have written music for solo cello, so hopefully that will change. All right. On topic, while practicing a new piece, how do you know when to move on? Do you ever get trapped in a perfection loop? Yes, that is something to definitely avoid because there is, you gain a lot by learning music to keep on pumping new notes in your fingers and in your mind. So I do think that you need to kind of give yourself a test when you're learning a piece, get in front of people, perform it. Because that's only then will you know if it's good enough or not. And then maybe perform it a few times. But while you're doing that, always be learning new notes in some piece. I also find that for a piece that I've performed a few times, sometimes when you get too close to something, I have a hard time warming up before a concert. And so, not so much anymore, but like in the past. And so what I would do is I would actually practice like the next piece that I have to learn. And the process of learning that piece, I kind of forget where I am. And I'm still exploring, I'm trying things out here and there. And I can really get my playing to a certain place performatively and ready for a concert without kind of getting more nervous about the piece that I actually have to play. So always put yourself in a situation to learn new material, always. How to end a piece with a long up bow, diminuendo, in a slow tempo. Yeah, well, don't hold your breath, right? Because of course you want to lighten the bow, maybe slow down the speed. You might want to change the contact point. The most important thing though is don't hold your breath, because if you're holding your breath in any way, you're getting softer and softer and you're getting closer to the frog. Of course the bow is going to bounce. So make sure to keep on breathing. Another technique you might want to try is if if you're moving along, if you're on an up bow, to actually move with the up bow, right? Because that will actually cumulatively make for a slower bow. So if you keep on moving up bow like this, that can you can construct a slowdown of the bow speed that way. Let's see, recommend a resource for learning about technologies for incorporating electronics in one's playing. I am not aware of one. I am not aware of one. I think that probably your best bet is to, gosh, that's a good question. That's a very good question because I think most cellists that I know who use a lot of electronics um, did everything just sort of experimenting, and trying things out, and trial and error, and picking up some equipment and learning some pieces or improvising or something like that. But I am not aware of a resource online where you can go to learn, except for this this forum. I would recommend, though, if you do want to step into the world of electronics, when you one thing that's sometimes hard to understand is like, well, what kind of microphone do I use? Or do I need an interface or speakers and blah, blah, blah. And just I know we're running out of time here, but uh, if you're playing by yourself, actually the best microphone I would recommend for most situations is a DPA mic. It just kind of clips onto the strings below the bridge. That's a great close mic. It is hypercardioid, which means that it's very focused on your sound. The problem is if you play in a more like, let's say, rock band type situation, you don't have enough isolation with your sound. So you will need something that's maybe a bridge mic, or something like that. For those situations, I actually use an electric cello. I just don't deal with acoustic sound at all. But if you want to have a good cello sound in most situations, I would recommend a DPA. I would also suggest getting an interface, an external interface, because that helps to translate the audio signal with digital signal into your laptop. Yes, you'll probably need a laptop. Um, Speakers can be helpful, but you don't necessarily need speakers. But that will enable you to, because through the interface, you can send that out into what we call a chain of effects if you want to use a distortion pedal or reverbs or octaves or anything like that, wah-wah pedal, whatever you want. So that's how that works. But yeah, that's a very good question. There should be a resource somewhere, but I'm honestly not aware of one. Okay, really quickly, let's see. What are your comments on using pedals arraying, or using like Ableton? I think the Ableton is fantastic. I don't use it myself, not because I don't like it, but because I haven't had a need. But I do feel like it is in my future. It seems like a very functional, very versatile bit of software, and I recommend it, even though I don't use it myself. Bluetooth, actually MIDI is fantastic. I do recommend using MIDI because it enables you to trigger a lot of sounds and backing tracks without using your hands. And that's very important when you're a cellist because when you're playing, your hands are busy. It's not like you're a pianist and you turn the page like this. You can't do that on the cello. So you're very reliant on your feet. So get used to doing a lot of fancy footwork. But getting a good MIDI foot pedal will go a long way to being able to do a lot of things. I don't like Bluetooth very much because Bluetooth is very unreliable. It can be affected by if, let's say, you're playing in a museum or a club where the audience is very close, cell phone use may actually create interference in the air. And so my recommendation is if you can plug it in, do that. Bluetooth looks fancy, but you may run into a situation where the Bluetooth doesn't connect. So I would recommend avoiding that when you can. Although I do use Bluetooth for my page turner with my iPad. But aside from that, I would not do that live. Pedal boards, yes, I recommend. Fifths, about the fifths you were... I'm not sure what you mean about the harmonics, but maybe we can save that for the next CelloChat. How to score study effectively? Well, just really briefly on score study, I would say that I'm always fascinated with what we call, first of all, mental practice, because it implies that we have like, you know, mental problems or something. But I know what we mean by mental practice, and that's the idea of kind of using our imagination and following with the score. I find it a very good tool because what many of you maybe have found the same thing, that we tend to make the same mistakes in our mind away from the cello. So we miss the same shifts, we play the same notes out of tune, et cetera, et cetera. So mentally, it's a good idea to kind of erase those ideas from our mind away from the instrument. It's no guarantee that we'll play it perfectly on the cello, but I think that having these ideas in our head is a guarantee that we're going to miss it on the cello. So we do have to do what we can to kind of build our mental strength, as it were, through score study and the like. Also, when we do study scores, I think that's a very important tool as well, because whether you're playing music by memory or not, we do have a visual memory of the music, and so that helps us to anticipate where we are on the roadmap of the piece. And then finally, any young players in summer to become a better cellist. Yes, summer is a great time to take on projects, to say, I'm going to learn this concerto, I'm going to learn this Bach suite. I would definitely recommend, it's like if you take on a book for the summer, like if you take on a piece, like I'm going to learn the third Bach suite, that's a great project for any individual throughout the summer. As far as summer camps, of course, everything, because of COVID, this is a very unusual situation. I do teach at the Bowdoin Summer Festival, which I think is a fantastic festival for chamber music, solo, and there's even a bit of orchestra. So when there are plans for kind of a virtual camp this summer, but then when things do open up next year, I definitely recommend coming out in person. It's a great place to be over the summer. Okay, I think that this is going to be where we wrap up. Thank you very much for being with me this morning and allowing me to share some stories about what we all have to, with the challenges that we have to face when we play music that has never been played before. So I think onward and upward, and best of luck with everyone. Get back to practicing, and please stay healthy and please stay safe. And have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.